Marsilio Ficino, the Italian Platonist and Catholic priest, born near Florence in 1433, is well known in Western esotericism and Renaissance studies for his pivotal Latin translations of what became the Corpus Hermeticum, completed in 1463 and printed in 1471. Ficino likewise translated the complete works of Plato, published in 1484 with full commentaries printed in the 1480s and 1490s. Ficino also translated the works of Plotinus on the apparent enthusiastic advisement of Pico della Mirandola, completed in 1486. He was bankrolled first by Cosimo de' Medici, one of the richest men in Europe at the time, who famously requested that Ficino translate the Corpus Hermeticum, the religious and philosophical writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, at a time when Ficino had not yet completed the translations of Plato. Cosimo therefore was able to read the Corpus Hermeticum not long before his death in 1464. Later, Lorenzo de' Medici became Ficino's patron. Ficino became one of the leading minds of the Italian Renaissance and headed the rather informal Platonic Academy in Florence, established around 1462. Ficino inspires no shortage of considerations and studies. For our part, we will focus on his perspective of Hermes Trismegistus, the Hermetic books, and the ancient theology succeeding from Hermes or Zoroaster. Although Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum has been at times exaggerated in its immediate influence, it was no small feat at the time, and solidified the Corpus Hermeticum in Western cultural memory, putting Hermes Trismegistus into the hands of brilliant minds like Lodovico Lazzarelli, Robert Flood, Isaac Newton, Ralph Cudworth, and so many more. This can be loosely argued to have formed a new Hermetic tradition, so-called, as it influenced readers who were already familiar with the references to the Hermetic books and to Hermes Trismegistus, found in the writings of various church fathers and in the so-called Emerald Tablet. The tractate called the Asclepius was already in circulation and had been commented on by church fathers like Lactantius, Clement of Alexandria, and Augustine. This new Hermetic understanding, offered by Ficino's 14 tractates in Latin, did not create a reconstructed religion, nor did it aspire to any widespread, reconstructed practice in and of itself, unless by way of becoming later attached to various occult movements, societies, and brotherhoods, alchemical, Rosicrucian, and Masonic. Nonetheless, considering scholars and philosophers in the 15th century generally regarded Hermes Trismegistus as either predating Moses, being his contemporary, or having lived soon thereafter, and often imagined Hermes to be a single historic man, a prophetic figure, or a divine being reincarnated into at least 5 manifestations, to possess a readable version of all Hermetic books must have felt like possessing genuine Egyptian religious teachings. All the more important when one keeps in mind the notions of earlier writers like Iamblichus, who claimed Pythagoras and Plato drew inspiration directly from Hermes during their travels into Egypt. This confused timeline in relation to Hermes and Moses is famously depicted in the Siena Cathedral in Italy, where a potential Moses can be seen taking deference to Hermes Trismegistus, and the following citation, made with the mosaic panel in 1373, is taken from an abbreviated quote from the Asclepius, and perceived as a prophecy of the coming Christ. Quote, "God, the creator of all things, made God who is with him visible and made him the first and only, in whom he was delighted, and greatly loved him, his own Son, who is called the Holy Word." Indeed, in one place in his Platonic theology, Ficino allows himself to wonder whether or not Moses and Hermes were the same person. Specifically, Ficino wrote, when comparing the cosmology of Mosaic Genesis to that of Hermes, quote, "Trismegistus Mercurius teaches more clearly such an origin of the generation of the world, nor need we wonder that this man knew so much, if this Mercurius was the same man as Moses, as Artapanus, the historian, shows with many conjectures. For a well-read individual familiar with the classical importance related to the Egyptian god Thoth, the Greek Hermes, and their amalgamated Trismegistus, and familiar with early Christian, medieval, and Arabic depictions of Hermes as the premier Egyptian sage, holding these new Hermetic books may have felt profoundly grand indeed, especially considering that they offered not merely new dogmas and speculations, but a series of individual initiatory practices, answers to many fundamental religious and theological questions, and a rich base of lore that seemingly corresponded with many other religious or mystical texts, including especially the Book of Genesis. I note in passing that while many consider the study of the Hermetic books as a merely historical consideration and a kind of literary amusement, others more familiar with mystical states of being and genuine experiential confrontations with divinity found and still find an entirely different importance, as we read them not to measure how they affected later writers, whether or not they were forged or dated correctly, but in an effort to investigate divine reality from this Hermetic initiatory tradition that did not merely speculate about divine matters, but directly consulted them through immediate experience, passed from master to disciple in late antique Egypt. This approach renders the silly statements about how everything was downhill from Plato into intellectual rubbish, promulgated in no small part by analytical, history-focused academics who apparently disregard the immediate presence of experiential potential that is repeatedly emphasized in the Hermetic corpus. Considering we have already covered how certain misconceptions about Hermes Trismegistus began and how it was later addressed and corrected in other essays, we will focus strictly on Ficino's understanding of Hermes, considering it would shape a great deal of the perception about this figure even after the overall dating of the corpus was pushed forward, due in major part to the philological, linguistic evidence brought forward by Isaac Casaubon in 1614. But to imagine that a later date of the available Hermetic books means there aren't earlier Egyptian precursors, or that the information contained in Hermetica is somehow inapplicable, would be an admission that one hasn't observed the spiritual value in the Corpus Hermeticum, and rather suggests that one's motive in researching Hermetica is quite distant from the aims of the Hermetic initiates themselves. Today's video is sponsored by our friends at Gallowglass Books. Gallowglass Books has published a beautiful edition of Thomas Taylor's translations of the Neoplatonists, and a recent hardcover edition of Francis Yates' Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition. This work is an essential study of the Hermetic writings as they influenced many premier thinkers of the Renaissance. Get your copy of Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition through the link below in the description, as there are only 150 left of this limited edition. To truly understand Ficino's Hermes requires a comparative approach between the corpus and the books of Moses, and of how Hermes was treated by Augustine and Lactantius. I will eventually do a full essay on these particulars, but let us at the very least glance over some of the obvious streams of influence. Ficino knew well of the numerous Hermes stemming from Cicero's Nature of the Gods, where 5 Hermes are described to have lived at different times, variously described as a god or a divine man, depending. Ficino also knew of Iamblichus's first statement in De Mysteriis about the Egyptian priests attributing their sacred texts to Hermes as an inspirational honorific, indicative of a role in a legitimate priesthood of Thoth. But as early as 130 AD, the church father Justin Martyr mentions Hermes in quite the positive light, and he is followed by a number of church fathers, whose passages about Hermes naturally affected how later Christians of the Renaissance and earlier periods received Hermes and Hermetica. Justin Martyr, the early Christian apologist, born in Samaria, had access to a Hermetic text in the 2nd century, wherein Hermes declared, quote, "To understand God is difficult, to speak of him impossible, even for one who can understand." Justin likewise refers to Hermes as the Word in the famous passage in his Apology where he declares, quote, "And when we say that the Word, which is the first begetting of God, was begotten without intercourse, Jesus Christ our Master, and that he was crucified and was dead and rose again and ascended into heaven, we bring forward no new thing beyond those among you who are called sons of Zeus. For ye know how many sons the writers who are held in honor among you ascribe to Zeus, Hermes the Word, who was the interpreter and teacher of all, and Asclepius, who was also a healer, and was smitten by the bolt of his sire and ascended into heaven." Justin found Hermes to be a son of God who brought tidings from God and regarded God with ineffability, which Justin presumed was in agreement with the most ancient of authors. Athenagoras, the Athenian anti-Nicene Christian apologist, writing around 176, was aware of Greek literature circulating under the name of Hermes Trismegistus, and uses this source in support of his euhemeristic understanding that the gods were once all human beings. Clement, the Christian theologian teaching in Alexandria, writing at the end of the 2nd century, also regarded Hermes as a man who once lived among the Egyptians but had been deified according to human opinion. Clement famously provides a ceremonial procession of the contemporary Hermetic priesthood of his time, which we have extensively documented elsewhere, as it is one of the most important pieces of literary evidence for the late Hermetic cult, and demonstrates that the books of Hermes dealt with every known science and occult matter of its time. Tertullian, the early Christian apologist and polemicist from Carthage, writing at the beginning of the 3rd century, mentioned Hermes as the master of all physics, and credited him with ancient wisdom, albeit with a more negative and critical tone. He mentions the Egyptian Hermes as one, quote, "with whom especially Plato had intercourse, and had been thought to be a god by his readers and not merely inspired." The Egyptian Hermes is also considered as a potential source for the doctrine of reincarnation, and is seen to have taught that the soul remains individuated after death. With these mentions and those of earlier fathers, we begin to see how the Hermes of Egypt could be quite naturally placed in the very beginning of Ficino's succession of ancient philosophers in the Prisca Theologia. Cyprian, the North African Christian bishop of Carthage, writing in the early and middle of the 3rd century, stated, "Thrice-Greatest Hermes speaks of the one God, and confesses him beyond all understanding and all appraisement." The Christian apologist Arnobius, writing in the early 4th century, mentioned the philosophical schools that laugh at Christians, saying, You I single out, who belong to the school of Hermes, or of Plato and Pythagoras, and the rest of you who are of one mind and walk in union in the same paths of doctrine." Though modern scholars have become quite well versed in squinting at the minute differences between philosophical approaches, and then asserting that such differences make the different philosophies irreconcilable, this notion of pagan schools being of one mind, walking down the same paths in unison, is not indicative of a misunderstanding on Arnobius's part, but instead points to a realization that so long as the high-stakes fundamentals remain similar, such as the immortality of the soul and the existence of the first principal deity, then different schools can be found to be in agreement on the more important subjects. Arnobius was a converted philosopher and taught the next important Christian in the succession, Lactantius, who among the Christian fathers had probably the greatest influence on Ficino's approach to Hermes. Lactantius, the North African Christian and advisor to Emperor Constantine I, who flourished in the beginning of the 4th century, followed Cicero in the enumeration of 5 different Hermes, the final being Thoth, who came into Egypt after slaying Argus, quote, "and initiated the Egyptians into laws and letters." Lactantius's Egyptian Hermes is of great antiquity, worships an ineffable singular god, and was a man who was later deified. Of course, this idea of a Greek Hermes coming into Egypt Hellenized a distinctly Egyptian god, but it somewhat fits the pattern for those who prefer to claim Hermes for themselves. Lactantius wrote favorably of Hermes, especially because Hermes' beliefs lined up to various Christian theological understandings, and was by all available evidence a precursor to them. What were these common understandings shared between Hermetic and Christian teachings as Lactantius saw them? 1. The ineffability of the name of God and his unbegotten status. 2. The supreme God and creative demiurge. 3. The logos of wisdom and divine order that issued from the first principle. 4. The belief that virtue was the primary way to worship God, and that 5. Piety was experiential gnosis of God. 6. The idea that man was made by God and in the image of God. 7. The mortal and immortal dual aspects of man. And 8. A cosmic restoration of mankind through a seemingly catastrophic reset. For as Lactantius put it, Trismegistus, who has tracked out, I know not how, almost all truth, has often described the power and greatness of the Word, as the above quotation from him shows, in which he confesses the Word to be ineffable and holy, and in that its telling forth transcends the power of man. Augustine, the Christian theologian, also from Roman North Africa, writing in the early 5th century, takes a mostly negative approach to Hermes, treating the Asclepius with many commentaries. He criticized Hermes' doctrine of demons, statue animation, and ridiculed Hermetica on many different fronts, suggesting that, like his own conception of Hermes, the Egyptian gods were all ancient men. In the next place, Cyril of Alexandria, Patriarch of Alexandria in the early 5th century, placed the Egyptian Hermes after Moses and was of the general understanding that Pythagoras and Plato obtained wisdom from these two Egyptians, and that Hermes specifically is, quote, found to have grasped the doctrines of Moses. Cyril takes an overall positive approach to Hermes, had access to at least 15 Hermetic tractates or treatises, and in one place quotes Hermes in this interesting fragment, later documented by Stobaeus. Quote, If then there be an incorporeal eye, let it go forth from the body unto the vision of the beautiful, let it fly up and soar aloft, seeking to see not form nor body, nor even types of things, but rather that which is the maker of all these, the quiet and serene, the stable and the changeless one, the self, the all, the one, the self of self, the self in self, the like to self alone, that which is neither like to other nor yet unlike to self, and yet again himself. Though there are later noteworthy Christians who quoted from the Hermetic corpus and various fragments, the above sources, and mainly that of Lactantius, can be seen to influence Marsilio Ficino's conception of Hermes. These Christian leaders paved the way for later Christians to flirt with, if not wholly adore, more controversial pagan texts, especially those that could be seen to have been direct inspiration for Christian theological principles. But let us allow Ficino to speak of Hermes for himself. In the foreword to Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, he presents an outline of the genealogy of Hermes Trismegistus that would, like those mentions from the Christian fathers, continue to influence many later writers and scholars who referred to Ficino's translation. Quote, At the time of Moses' birth, there lived Atlas the astrologer, who was the brother of the physicist Prometheus, and, on the mother's side, the grandfather of the elder Mercury, whose grandson was Mercury Trismegistus. Augustine wrote this concerning him, while Cicero and Lactantius were of the opinion that this Mercury was the fifth, and that it was the fifth Mercury who was called Theut by the Egyptians and Trismegistus by the Greeks. He supposedly killed Argus, ruled over the Egyptians, and gave them laws and letters, but he made the form of the characters in the shapes of plants and living beings. This Mercury enjoyed such admiration from his fellow men that he was elevated into the ranks of the gods, and a great number of temples were erected in his honor. Out of respect, his real name was not to be pronounced in daily life or without reason. Among the Egyptians, the first month of the year was named after him, and a city was founded by him that is now called Hermopolis in Greek, that is, City of Mercury. But he is called Trismegistus, that is, thrice great, because he was the greatest philosopher, the greatest priest, and the greatest king. For there is among the Egyptians, as Plato writes, the custom of choosing the priests from among the philosophers, and the king from the community of priests. That one thus outshone all the philosophers in astuteness and erudition, and he was thus made a priest. But as a priest he was superior to all the priesthood in the holiness of his life and in adoration of the gods, with the result that finally he received the royal dignity, and as king he placed the fame of the earlier kings in the shadows through his lawful rule and military deeds, so that he was rightly called thrice great. As the first philosopher, he turned from natural and mathematical things to contemplation of the divine. He was the first to discuss with great wisdom the majesty of God, the ordering of the spirits, and the changes of the soul. He was called the first author of theology. He was followed by Orpheus, who gained second rank among the ancient theologians. Aglaophimus was initiated into the Orphic mysteries. Pythagoras followed him in theology, and the latter was followed by Philolaus, who was the teacher of our divine Plato. There thus arose a single, internally consistent Prisca Theologia, primal theology, from 6 theologians in wonderful order, which had its beginning in Mercury and its fulfillment in Plato. Mercury wrote a great number of books about knowledge of the divine, in which, by a mortal god, secret mysteries and astonishing oracles were revealed. He often spoke not just as a philosopher, but as a prophet. He foresaw the fall of the ancient religions, the coming of Christ, the judgment to come, the resurrection, the glory of the blessed, and the punishment of the sinners. Augustine thus wonders whether he brought forth much from his knowledge of the stars or through the revelation of demons. But Lactantius does not hesitate to count him among the Sibyls and prophets. Later on in other works, namely in his commentary on Plato's Philebus in 1469, Ficino would bring Zoroaster into the succession at the very beginning, but not in any manner that removed that special credit he afforded to Hermes. For Ficino, Hermes is one, quote, at whom wondered first the Egyptians and the other nations, and subsequently the ancient Christian theologians, in utter stupefaction at Hermes's doctrine rare of things divine. This utter stupefaction, and the previously described astonishing oracles and secret mysteries are but a few examples of Ficino expressing his personal high regard for Hermetica. Hermes Trismegistus served also as a means to keep the mysterious Egyptian tradition alive, insomuch as its Renaissance and medieval enthusiasts still understood Hermes to have participated in ancient Egyptian mysteries, being their foremost instructor. Hermes, for Ficino, offered information pertaining to direct revelation and genuine experience, distinct from the more Socratic, argumentative, and inquisitive basis for spiritual insight, more at home in the Platonic streams of thought. It was not just due to a chronographic error that Ficino and so many earlier writers persisted with the belief of a far more ancient Hermes Trismegistus, but due to the internal revelation and mystical praxis within the corpus of texts. Aside from this, what we should keep in mind, to the credit of so many authors imagining Hermetica as genuinely ancient in either their information or origin, is that, though they lacked all translations of Egyptian hieroglyphics and writing, they insisted on the antiquity of Hermes Trismegistus and regarded Hermetica as a true vessel of ancient Egyptian theology. This had already been established in the background and taken for granted, as we've seen with the Christian Fathers, and as can be seen from 2 legitimate Hermetic practitioners, or recipients of the tradition, Zosimus of Panopolis, the alchemist, and the divine Iamblichus, the Neoplatonist and theurgist. We are at present quite bludgeoned over the head with reminders of how late the Hermetica were, being of the 2nd or 3rd centuries, and further reminded of how likely it was that they were tampered with, especially by Byzantine Christian scribes. And yet, the more genuine ancient Egyptian religion that we uncover, and with new insights from the Thoth cult literature, we can hardly pretend the Corpus Hermeticum emerged fresh from the abyss with purely Hellenic sources of inspiration. Rather, the picture is becoming more and more clear that Hermetica contain living Egyptian wisdom, adapted and considered alongside the Greek language and the Hellenic worldview, which had long spread through Egypt, most significantly following Alexander the Great. We cannot, on one hand, notice the assimilation of Hermes with the more ancient Egyptian deity Thoth, and then accuse the Hermetic authors of forging their works without Egyptian influence. The priests of Thoth and their House of Life produced far more literature, theological, and experiential teachings than we have yet uncovered. As I have noted elsewhere, by the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, ending in 229 BC, an Egyptian priest, Manetho, already referred to 2 Hermes, saying that the 2nd Hermes, Trismegistus, was Ptolemy II's ancestor. By this time, Manetho credited Hermes Trismegistus with an extraordinary amount of writings and says that Thoth had been the first Hermes and had inscribed a stele in Syria in the sacred hieroglyphic letters after the flood. Taking this at face value, it indicates an Egyptian understanding that Hermetic literature already preceded the Ptolemaic dynasty, more than 3 to 4 centuries prior to the accepted dating of the Corpus Hermeticum. Thoth's role in presiding over and inspiring writing, magic, and mysteries is entirely ancient and persists in these exact characteristics up into the time of the formal Thoth-Hermes amalgamation. In this way, we should at least notice what writers like Ficino got right in their assumption of Hermetica containing more ancient wisdom than that merely derived out of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Because regardless of this error in dating the Hermetica, that there are strains of wisdom contained within it that may indeed have far earlier and purely Egyptian sources is increasingly likely, and in some cases already demonstrated, especially if you take a more universalist and experiential approach to religious principles. But there is a consistent practice among Phil-Hellenists and lovers of the Western esoteric tradition to reduce everything to Plato's footnotes, and seemingly forget that Plato himself recognized Egypt and their god of wisdom with profound and ancient knowledge, to the point of putting the following statement in the mouth of an Egyptian priest who lived in the 6th century BC and was close to 90 years old. Quote, "You are young in soul, every one of you, for you possess not a single belief that is ancient and derived from old tradition, nor is your understanding gray with age." The Hermetic literature translated by Ficino characterizes merely one strain of renewed interest in Hermes Trismegistus. Another strain, with no contact to the Corpus Hermeticum, can be found among the Alchemo-Paracelsists. It is useful then to notice how recipients of this other strain of Hermetic interest also saw Hermes, and how they could access the same sources Ficino did without the Corpus Hermeticum and draw generally the same conclusions about Hermes Trismegistus. What does this tell us in regards to Ficino? It at the very least adds more evidence to the idea that Ficino invented nothing regarding his perception of Hermes, and his viewpoint was legitimized by all the earlier sources he had access to. To illustrate this different strain of Hermetic enthusiasm, we can look at Christoph Balduff's brief, clear, and true instruction concerning the mysterious and obscure art of chemia, from the year 1609. This German strain of the Hermetic art, stemming from Paracelsus, notices a different and more alchemical succession of ancient philosophers, but can be compared to Ficino's understanding of Hermes as a useful counterpart. Quote, "Hermes was a wise man in Egypt, as several write, before King Pharaonis, and he should be called Termaximus, because already in those days he spoke of the Holy Trinity. Others give this reason, that he was a brilliant philosopher, priest, and king in Egypt at the time when Moses was born, and that he wrote many strange, wonderful, mysterious, and obscure things about the divine. Though Augustine was skeptical as to whether he got that from spirits or stars, Lactantius counted him among the Sibyls and prophets. But what he wrote about Chimica, I know nothing more than a little tract of 7 chapters, and another called Tabula Smaragdina of Hermes, which he wrote with his own hand, and which is supposed to have been found in his grave by a woman named Sirach. And all the art of chemia is included therein, but in obscure language. Another philosopher named Hartilanus made a brief but entirely clear commentary and explanation of it. And in the books of the chemists, this Hermes is often cited as the most distinguished and oldest chemist, from whom all the others drew their art. With this in mind, it allows us to better understand Ficino's perspective about Hermes Trismegistus and the general excitement that ensued about the Corpus Hermeticum. With Hermes occupying such a distinguished place in the ancient theology of Ficino, affirmed by many Christian fathers and great pagan thinkers, subjects and ideas discussed within the Corpus Hermeticum worked their way into the minds of far-seeing philosophers and Christians who helped restore some understanding of ancient religion. But when Casaubon discovered that some Hermetic treatises must have been written much later than previously known, and suspected fraud due to Hermetica containing beliefs already present universally among Platonists and Christians, this point has generally been seen as the great decline of Hermetic enthusiasm in the Renaissance. This conclusion is nonetheless messy, as figures like Robert Fludd demonstrate, who wrote of Hermes as if Casaubon's discoveries did not exist. But notably, Ralph Cudworth, the English philosopher, Cambridge Platonist, and genius of comparative theology, in 1678, wrote a masterful defense of the Hermetic books against what he saw as a much too sweeping conclusion on Casaubon's part. Cudworth's extensive defense of the legitimacy of Hermetica was written in his The True Intellectual System of the Universe. Cudworth gives a fair critique of Ficino for having named all the Hermetic texts Poemander, and thus confusing later readers who may have thought the whole corpus was all one and the same book. But in general, Cudworth defends Hermetica, noticing 1. How many Hermetic books mentioned by the Fathers have not come down to us, and so it would be impossible to say they are all forgeries. 2. How it is not a valid argument that Hermetica were fabricated by Christian, Platonic, or Jewish writers, simply because they contain theological universals found across all of these traditions. 3. The antiquity of Thoth and the priesthood around him certainly produced a plethora of theological texts that the Hermetic writers had at least some access to. And so it was simply normal that equivalent books were written or translated into Greek at a time when that was the most popular language. 4. The testimonies of more ancient Hermetic books as mentioned by the Egyptian priest Manetho. 5. The testimony of Iamblichus that confirms the tradition of Egyptian priests ascribing their wisdom writing to Hermes, who offers no accusations of forgery. 6. Considering so much Platonic and Pythagorean wisdom was admittedly influenced by association with Egyptian priests, the Egypt cannot exactly be extracted out of these systems, and so even if later pagans living in Egypt wrote Hermetica, there is still inherently some Egyptian principles within. Cudworth proceeds with numerous other arguments, and in this way somewhat redeems Ficino's approach to Hermes, and rescues the value of Hermetica in the Enlightenment regardless of the later dates in which they were written. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to help keep the channel running, please find the links below in the description.